Ladies and gents, we're at Makings Fishery today. It's summertime and that means it's Pellet Waggler time. Here's my top 5 tips for getting the most out of the Pellet Waggler. So tip number 1, Pellet Waggler fishing is all about working hard. It's not a method for a lazy angler. You've got to be working hard at this game. After all, we're trying to catch fish shallow, so constant casting. You can see there, fish straight away. You can see that fish take the bait almost as soon as it hits the surface, so it's pointless leaving the rigging for any longer than 10 or so seconds. You need a hook bait falling through the water constantly. The other thing is, you've got to be feeding. I'm feeding sort of 2-3 pellets every 20 seconds. And to be fair, any opportunity I'm getting, I'm feeding 2 or 3 pellets. It's all about keeping some loose feed. Nice little mirror carp. It's all about keeping some loose feed in the top 2 or 3 feet of the water column. After all, you know, we're trying to catch shallow. We want to keep fish in those upper layers. Nice little mirror carp, plop him in the net. So there you go. Tip number 1, the Pellet Waggler is not a method for the lazy angler. So folks, tip number 2 is all about feeding. What I like to do is, before I cast out, 2 pellets into the swim. Chuck your float in the middle of those 2 pellets. 2 more pellets around your float. And you can see it's not about feeding large amounts of bait, it's about feeding small amounts but regular. Another little carp there, look. What I'm actually trying to do is keep those fish in the upper layers competing. And if I was to feed large amounts, sort of like 10, 20 pellets at a time, it'd be impossible for those fish to eat all those pellets in the top 2 foot of the water column. So obviously a few pellets would drop down. That'll take the fish with them, away from where my hook bait's going to be sitting. So by feeding those small amounts of pellets more often, you're keeping those fish competing. One thing I like to do as well, I'll show you a little sneaky tip once I've got this fish in the net. Nice little carp, a little common. Nice little fish. One thing I like to do as well is just flick a few pellets a rod length or so out. Doesn't it really need to be accurate, and there's good reason for that. When I'm feeding my swim just before I cast out, that's where my float sits. And you'll be surprised, you'll be really surprised the amount of fish, bonus fish, that you'll catch really short on a Pellet Waggler just while you're loose feeding your main swim. So it's worth, I even had a bite then, so it's worth just keeping a few pellets trickling in it, a rod length or so out, for when you feeding that main swim just before you cast out. Sort of like 1 or 2 fish at the end of the day can make a massive difference in a competition, and that's one of the reasons I like to do it. Let's talk about kit, and I'm actually going to work backward for a good reason. I'll explain in a little while. I've got a size 18 hook, eyed hook, and it's tied knotless knot style with a bait band on the hair. And I've tied that bait band really tight to the hook, which I think is quite important, especially for the fish we're catching today, which are averaging about 2 pounds. They've not got the biggest of mouths, so I want the hook bait quite close to the bend of the hook. That's 0.14 hook length, and I've actually just loop to loop that to the main line. I've tied a big loop in the main line, a small loop in the hook length, and just tied a loop to loop knot and lassoed it through the main line. Just above that loop, I've got 2 slot shot. Then I've got a snap link with my float on, and then another slot shot just to hold that float in place. Now, this is a really simple rig. It's actually very similar to a feeder rig or bomb rig that I'd use. The less stuff that you can put on your line, the better. The less tangles you'll get. It's much more simple and it's much stronger. If you start putting loads of swivels and different things on your main line, it's just going to weaken your line. You're going to get tangles at the end of the day. So a nice simple rig like that just works for you. It works for me, and no doubt it'll work for you as well. Now let's talk about floats. Now, quite a lot of you guys, when we talk about pellet waggler fishing, no doubt you think about this sort of thing. Nice big visible balsa pellet waggler. These ones are loaded. I prefer loaded wagglers for all my pellet waggler fishing, to be fair. And these floats, these thicker floats, have their place, to be honest. Now, I like to use these floats when I'm fishing with bigger pellets. I'm fishing really shallow, sort of like a foot deep, and I'm fishing a long way out and I need the extra casting weight. The trouble with these sort of bigger, stumpier floats though, is they don't sit in the water as nice. They quite often skid through the water because there's not enough length to them to hold them steady. And being quite thick as well, they also catch quite a bit of surface tow. Brilliant for visibility, brilliant for when you're feeding bigger baits, because the bigger float mimics those bigger baits plopping into the water. But when we're fishing on smaller venues like we are today for smaller fish, you need something a little bit more subtle, in my opinion. So that's when I move on to just a standard sort of like clear waggler, really. This is a midi fat boy float, slightly thicker than a lot of clear wagglers that you'll get on the market. That obviously aids with buoyancy, and I'd say this is a happy medium between a pellet waggler and your standard sort of like natural venue waggler float. So I carry these from, you know, really small floats up to floats that are sort of like almost 10-inch long. And the reason I like these floats, one, the weight is centralised right at the bottom. They cast like a dart. Two, the extra length aids the stability of the float in the water. And three, the smaller float mimics the smaller pellets that I like to feed. When I'm talking about pellet waggler, it's not always about feeding those larger pellets. I like to use 6mm and maybe even 4mm pellets quite often. And those size of pellets make a lovely little sound when they hit the water. I don't want to crash a big waggler in the middle. Those fish are just going to smell a rat straight away. So by using a little waggler, I can plop that float into that loose feed, mimic the pellets that I'm actually loose feeding, and hopefully those fish are going to come to the sound of the float a little bit better. The reason I've worked backwards is because I want to talk about the main line last, because I've mentioned I like to use a small float. That means using a lighter main line than I would normally use with the bigger pellet wagglers. I'm using 4 pound today. That makes casting the lighter floats a doddle, plus we've got a little bit of wind on the water, a little bit of surface tow. Any heavier main line and that float's going to be drifting out of the swim a little bit too often, and I want to keep that float in this exact same spot for as long as I can. I've set the rig today at 2 foot deep below the float. That's an ideal starting point. I might come shallower, I might go a little bit deeper, and to alter the length of that, alter the depth of the rig, I simply have to cut a hook length down to size and loop to loop it again onto the main line. So again, no swivels, no fancy clips, a really simple rig. My next tip revolves around casting. You cast in this method, and I like to use the line clip. I think accuracy is really, really important. And by using the line clip, it ensures I'm casting to the same place every single time. And because I'm using my float as a marker for my loose feed, it also means that I'm loose feeding in the same place every time. So what I'm doing in theory is creating a nice little area of attraction where my loose feed's going in, that's plopping on the surface, my float's plopping on the surface in the same place, and it just keeps those fish excited and in the area, really, in those top 2 feet of water in the area that I'm fishing. Another big plus point about using the line clip is it straightens the whole rig out. What I don't want to do is have the whole rig land in a heap on the water when I cast in. I want everything to land as softly as possible and as straight as possible. That way the pellet will fall through the water nice and slowly. The float won't make a big spladoosh sound as it goes in. It'll make a nice sound that mimics a pellet. And also, just like then, everything will be tight between hook pellet and rod tip. So instead of actually striking at little tiny dips on the float, the fish will hook itself against the rod tip 9 times out of 10. My last tip is about shotting the float. Now, for nearly all my pellet waggler fishing, I like to shot my float so it's barely visible above the surface. That way, there's hardly any resistance to a taking fish, and quite often the bites just rip your rod round. Something though that I think is really important, it's a nice little edge for later on in the session especially, is to add extra weight to your float. Just a number 8 slot shot, just bite him on there. And what that means is, when that pellet falls through the water and it reaches the full depth of your rig, that extra weight on your float is going to slowly sink your float, and you're actually going to cover more depth in the peg. You won't miss your bites, don't worry about that. Your bites will be literally your line tightening and your rod trying to head off into the middle of the lake. It's a great tip, especially for later on in the session and especially for wary fish.